The first thing anyone noticed about Emily Carter was that she didn't talk. Not at breakfast, where the long metal tables of Firebase Kestrel rang with the usual noise of men who had been in the desert too long, arguments about football, complaints about the food, running jokes that had lost their humor 3 months ago but kept circulating anyway. Like worn-out currency no one wanted to be the first to stop accepting. Not at morning briefing, where Sergeant First Class Dale Hutchins ran through the week's training itinerary with the flat, efficient voice of a man who had done this approximately 800 times and expected to do it 800 more. And not in the barracks afterward, when the older snipers Kowalski, Renfrew, and the one everyone called Brickhouse, whose actual name was Raymond Aldis, sat around the communal table playing cards and doing what snipers did when there was nothing to shoot at, which was talk about shooting. Emily sat 2 tables away and cleaned her rifle. She was 23 years old. She had brown hair she kept pulled back, a way of sitting very still that some people found calm and others found unnerving, and a service record that looked perfectly unremarkable on paper. Graduated Quantico, high marks on the range, no disciplinary notes, no commendations. She had been assigned to Firebase Kestrel 6 weeks ago as the unit's 3rd designated marksman, and in those 6 weeks she had said perhaps 200 words in the presence of other soldiers, a number Kowalski found suspicious, Renfrew found annoying, and Brickhouse found, for reasons he would not have been able to articulate, worth paying attention to. She hasn't seen real combat, Kowalski said one afternoon, not particularly quietly, in a tone that suggested he was making an observation rather than an insult. Though the distinction was mostly technical, he had 11 years on Emily, 2 tours in Fallujah, and a left shoulder that ached when the temperature dropped, which in the Arizona desert happened exactly never. He was not a cruel man. He simply had a clear and settled understanding of the difference between someone who had done a thing and someone who had practiced doing a thing. None of us have, lately, Brickhouse said. That's different. How's it different? Kowalski looked over at Emily, who was running a bore brush through the barrel of her M40 with the careful, unhurried attention of someone who had nowhere else to be and nothing else she would rather be doing. She looks at everything like she's taking a test, he said. Brickhouse watched her for a moment. Maybe she is, he said, and went back to his cards. Emily heard most of this. Sound carried differently in the desert than it did anywhere else. She had lived it moved in flat, clean lines, without the softening interference of walls or trees or weather, and she had learned early to simply accept what reached her rather than trying to filter it. She was not hurt by Kowalski's assessment. She was not particularly bothered by it. He was not wrong, exactly, and she had no interest in the kind of argument that would only make the next 3 months more uncomfortable. What she thought about, cleaning her rifle, was wind. Specifically, the wind she had watched all morning from the gun position on the eastern berm, the way it moved at ground level in short, stuttering gusts that didn't match what the weatherboard said, the way it flattened the scrub grass in one direction and then, 12 feet higher, moved a different direction entirely. The desert here sat in a shallow bowl ringed by ridges on 3 sides, and the topography did strange things to air movement that no standard ballistics model accounted for cleanly. She had been watching and trying to understand it since the first week. Her father, Staff Sergeant William Carter, had spent 16 years teaching her that the rifle was the last step. The first step, and the second, and the third, was understanding the space between you and the target. A bullet goes where physics sends it, he had told her once, in their backyard in Flagstaff, when she was 11, and he was trying to explain why she kept pulling left. Your job isn't to fight physics, your job is to know it better than the other guy. He died when she was 17. His name was on a wall now. She pulled the bore brush out, held the barrel to the light, checked, replaced it. Outside, the wind moved sideways across the berm in the way it always did around 2 in the afternoon. She watched it for a long time. The crisis started on a Tuesday. Firebase Kestrel received the distress signal at 0612, which was early enough that half the command staff was still in the middle of breakfast when the duty officer, Lieutenant Conrad Marsh, came into the mess hall with a tablet and a face that had gone the particular shade of gray that meant something real had happened. He found Colonel Warren Bridges at the officers' table, set the tablet in front of him, and said nothing, because the situation report said everything that needed saying. 3rd Battalion, Bravo Company, 512 Marines had been running a training exercise in the Viper Canyon system, 40 miles southeast of the firebase. The exercise was supposed to be straightforward. 2 days, simulated conditions, a controlled test of movement and communication under field constraints. It had been designed by people who believed they understood Viper Canyon, which was an understandable belief to have. given that they had run 17 previous exercises in the same terrain. What they had not fully accounted for was the ridge. The canyon had 3 main access routes: north, south, and the eastern pass, which was the one Bravo company had entered through. At some point in the last 24 hours, the exact timeline was unclear because the communications failure had made everything unclear. A force that should not have existed had materialized on the high ground above the valley floor. Not insurgents. Not a real enemy. The exercise had been compromised by a failure no one in the planning room had modeled. A rogue element, a former contractor unit now operating outside any legitimate sanction, had used the exercise as cover to move into the canyon and establish a position. They had live weapons they had already fired. The drone sent to assess was shot down at 0549. The relay satellite was experiencing interference, a technical fault. The communications officer said that they were working to resolve, which meant they were not going to resolve it in the next 90 minutes. At 0632, the signal had said 23 wounded, 3 critical. At 0701, it said 31 wounded. Communication degrades significantly after this transmission. By 7:30, when the command staff of Firebase Kestrel had assembled in the operations room a squat concrete building with maps covering every wall and a satellite feed that kept pixelating in the upper right corner where the interference was worse, the number of wounded Marines they were working with was 31, and the situation on the ground was one they could only partially see. The table was crowded with senior officers, Colonel Bridges at the head, flanked by Major Glenn Sharp, who ran tactical planning, and Captain Veronica Holt, who handled communications. Standing along the wall were the platoon leaders, the intel officer, a logistics coordinator who kept trying to speak and kept being interrupted, and in the back, half visible behind the standing bodies of people who outranked him considerably, Dale Hutchins. Emily was not in the room. Emily was in the adjoining prep area, where she had been told to wait with the other snipers while command figured out what it was going to do. "We have a window," Major Sharp said, pointing at the topographic map. "North approach is clean. We pushed 2 fire teams in fast and..." "Negative," Bridges said. "North approach narrows at the 3-mile mark. Channeled movement. If they've got the high ground and they can see us coming, they can't see us coming if we move before sunrise. We're past sunrise." Sharp looked at his watch, looked at the map, said nothing. Captain Holt was working her console. "I've got partial satellite, enough for a still image every 4 minutes. The last one shows movement on the central ridge. That's your fire position, but the resolution isn't clean enough to tell me exactly where. Estimate? 500 meters on either side of the primary ridge axis. That's a 2-kilometer window." "That's not a window," Bridges said. "That's a horizon." Outside the operations building, the desert was already heating toward 90 degrees, and it was barely 8 in the morning. The first relief team went out at 0815 under Sergeant Patricia Dunn, 12 Marines, moving fast along what the map said was a covered approach through a dry wash on the southern flank. They made it 2 miles before encountering fire. The wash was not as covered as the map said. They pulled back with 1 soldier down, non-critical. Dunn came back into the operations room with dust on her face and a look that she kept carefully neutral. "They've got eyes on the southern approach," she said. "Elevated position. At least 2 shooters, maybe 3. The second team tried the east." There was no third team, because the east was where Bravo Company had entered, and the east was no longer accessible. The second team didn't make it as far as the first. Inside the operations room, the arguments had reached a frequency and intensity that filled the space like static. Major Sharp and Captain Holt had been going back and forth over a tactical option that seemed to involve a coordinate strike on the ridgeline, which Bridges kept rejecting on the grounds that without clean targeting data, a coordinate strike was as likely to hit their own people as the opposition. 2 junior officers had proposed an air request, which was technically possible but practically 40 minutes away and required authorizations they didn't have time to get. The logistics coordinator had been silenced some time ago. The arguments moved in circles, which was what arguments did when the people making them already knew that none of the available options was good enough. It was the kind of situation that exposed the difference between tactical training and tactical judgment. Training could give you a menu of responses, but judgment was what you needed when none of the responses on the menu applied cleanly. Bridges had seen it before. He had always believed somewhat grimly, that the real test of any officer was what they did when the doctrine ran out, when the manual had been consulted and found insufficient, and the next step had to come from somewhere else entirely. He stared at the map. The canyon system spread across the topographic lines in a configuration that should have been manageable. 3 access routes, elevated approaches on the east and north, a valley floor wide enough, in theory, to allow coordinated movement. It was the kind of terrain that looked controllable on a map and expressed its full complexity only once you were inside it, which was a problem that maps had been failing to warn people about for as long as maps had existed. Kowalski, who was standing near the door with Renfrew, had volunteered to try the shot. He was the unit's best sniper by record. His service file listed multiple confirmed long-range engagements from Ramadi to Kandahar, and no one in the room had any reason to doubt him. Colonel Bridges had taken him up on it without hesitation. Kowalski had gone to the gun position on the berm's northern face, looked through his scope, taken 3 ranging measurements with the methodical patience of someone who had done this enough times that the steps had become automatic rather than deliberate, calculated, adjusted, and taken his shot at 0901. He missed. He came back into the room and said so directly, which Bridges respected. A lesser soldier would have found a way to qualify it, to locate the failure in the conditions rather than the execution, to leave himself some room. Kowalski did not do that. He said he had missed, and then he said why. Wind model says 12 knots from the northwest, Kowalski said. Steady. I built the correction. The shot should have landed clean, and? Bridges asked. And there's something happening in the air over that terrain that the model doesn't account for. There's a shear layer. Ground level and above ground are running different directions, maybe different speeds. I've done desert work before, but I've never seen it behave like this specific bowl. I don't know how to calculate the full effect without more data, and I don't know how to get more data without going into the terrain, which is exactly what we can't do right now. He said this without apology and without embarrassment, because he was the kind of experienced professional who understood that accuracy about the limits of your own knowledge was not a weakness but a requirement. You could not solve a problem you were pretending did not exist. Bridges looked at the map, then at the satellite feed, which offered its blurred, 4-minute update, and told him nothing new. The upper right corner where the interference was worst had been pixelating since morning, and every 4 minutes when the image refreshed, Bridges found himself hoping it would show him something different, and every 4 minutes it showed him the same indistinct shape of a ridgeline in heat shimmer. How many people do we have in that valley? He asked, to no one in particular. 512, the intel officer said quietly. Last confirmed count. The number sat in the room like a weight no one could pick up. The prep area connected to the operations building through a single door that stayed propped open, because the air conditioning in the main room made the prep area hot when it was closed. Emily had been sitting near that door for 2 hours. She had a notebook open on her lap, a small, spiral-bound one, the kind sold at gas stations, and she had been writing in it. Not in the way of someone passing time, in the way of someone working through a problem. She had been watching the dust streamers on the perimeter fence since early morning. There were 6 of them, red strips of cloth, zip-tied to the chain link at different heights, put there by some previous iteration of the base's safety protocols for reasons that had probably made sense at the time. The streamers at knee height moved one way. The ones at shoulder height moved differently. The one she could see through the prep area's small window, the highest one, near the top of the fence, roughly 10 feet up, had been doing something interesting all morning. It was not moving with the others. It moved against them, in short reversals. At intervals, she had been timing. She had a formula in the notebook. It was not a formula from any manual she had ever been issued. It was one she had been building over 6 weeks from observation, from the meteorology texts she'd borrowed from the base library, and the topographic data she'd found in the shared drive, and the long afternoons watching dust devils form and dissolve in the bowl of terrain around the firebase. It was not a complete formula. It was not certain, but it accounted for something that the standard ballistics model did not, which was the thermal shear layer that formed in desert bowl terrain in the middle hours of the morning when the ground heated faster than the air above it. She thought about her father, not about his death, about his hands, the way he had held a rifle, with a looseness that looked careless until you understood it was the opposite, until you understood that every tension he removed from his grip was a variable he was eliminating. The body lies to you, he had told her. It wants to be tight. Tight feels like control. Tight is the enemy of accuracy. She wrote something in the notebook, looked at it. Through the open door, she heard Major Sharp say, "We're losing them." She closed the notebook. She stood up, walked to the door, and stood in the frame. "They're not where you think," she said. The room did not hear her, or it heard the words without processing them, which amounted to the same thing. The conversation continued over and past her as if she had not spoken. The maps, the coordinates, the arguments about air support and timing and authorization. Emily went back to her seat. She opened the notebook again, but she kept the door in her peripheral vision. At 0947, she walked into the operations room. She did not knock. She did not wait to be addressed. She walked in with the notebook in her left hand and stopped 3 feet inside the doorway, and the room registered her presence in the way that rooms register unexpected entries. A brief disruption in the current of conversation, a few heads turning. "Corporal," Hutchins said, in a tone that was more warning than greeting. "I need to speak to Colonel Bridges," she said. Bridges was at the head of the table. He had the look of a man who had been making decisions for 4 hours that he knew were inadequate and was running out of anything better. He looked at Emily. He looked at Hutchins. He nodded. "You have 1 minute," he said. Emily laid the notebook flat on the table, not open yet, just flat. "The sniper position on the central ridge isn't where the satellite image shows," she said. "The image is getting a heat signature off the rock face. They're behind the secondary outcropping, 30 meters north of the assumed position. That's why Sergeant Kowalski's shot was off. He was aimed at the right ridge. Wrong point." Silence. "Of a kind." "How do you know that?" Sharp asked. "I don't know it with certainty, but the behavior of the dust streamers on the perimeter fence at 3 different heights tells me the shear layer in this terrain shifts the apparent heat signature northward in morning conditions. The satellite is reading surface temp, not depth. The position looks central because that's where the heat is highest, but the heat is highest there because of rock orientation, not because of human activity." She opened the notebook. There was a diagram, small but precise, showing wind behavior at ground level, mid-level, and upper level in a bowl terrain configuration. Kowalski, standing against the wall, looked at the diagram, then at Emily, then at the diagram again. "The shot from the northern berm," Emily continued, "needs to account for 2 things the current model doesn't. First, the target position is 30 meters north of assumed. Second, the shear layer will cause vertical drift on the round between 300 and 400 meters out, approximately 0.8 degrees of angular correction, held for the full flight time, with the correction applied in the 3rd second of the firing sequence, not at the moment of squeeze. That's Renfrew started." "Corporal," Sharp said, and his voice had shifted from dismissive to something more complicated. "You're talking about a solution that requires—" "I know what it requires," Emily said. Bridges looked at her for a long moment. He was 61 years old and had been in this work for 38 of those years. And he had a strong, reliable sense for the difference between someone who was confident and someone who was competent. They were not the same category. He had met too many of one to mistake it for the other. "Show me," he said. She turned the notebook to face him and walked him through the numbers. When she was done, the room was quiet in a different way than it had been before. "What you're describing," Bridges said slowly, "requires precision I've never heard of at this range under these conditions. I know. If you're wrong, if any part of this is wrong, then you lose all 500, she said. "Which is what you're going to lose if you keep doing what you've been doing." She did not say it loudly. She did not need to. Bridges looked at the map, at the satellite feed, at the notebook on the table, with its 6 weeks of observations and its careful, unhurried arithmetic. He looked at the diagram Emily had drawn, the layered wind behavior, the 3-tier shear model, the correction calculation in the margin that had been checked and rechecked in the small, neat handwriting of someone who understood that the margin for error in what she was proposing was exactly 0. He had been in this work long enough to recognize the particular quality of a person who had arrived at a conclusion through process rather than intuition. Intuition could be brilliant or catastrophically wrong, and from the outside the two were often indistinguishable until the outcome settled the question. Process left a trail. The trail in the notebook was 6 weeks long, built in conditions with no audience and no stakes, which made it the most honest kind of preparation he could imagine. "If you're wrong," Sharp started again. "She heard you the first time," Bridges said. He looked at Emily for another moment. She stood still. She did not fidget, did not adjust her posture, did not perform any of the small physical negotiations that people made when they were waiting for a judgment to come down. She had said what she needed to say, and was now simply present with whatever followed. "Give her the rifle," he said. Kowalski didn't move for 3 seconds. Then he reached out and passed it to her. and it was the most significant gesture anyone made all day. The gun position on the northern berm was a shallow scrape in the earth, protected on 3 sides by sandbag walls, and open on the 4th to a direct line of sight across 40 miles of desert to the distant ridgeline of Viper Canyon. At this range, the canyon itself was invisible. What she could see was the shimmer of heat on the horizon and the fractional shadows where the terrain broke. She went prone. Behind her, at a distance that felt careful rather than respectful, as though they hadn't decided yet, which it was, stood Bridges, Hutchins, and Kowalski. Renfrew had stayed inside. He said it was to monitor the comms, which was true, and also to not watch, which was also true, and he did not see any contradiction in this. Emily settled the rifle into her shoulder. She did not immediately look through the scope. She looked at the fence first. The streamers, 3 of them visible from this angle. She watched them for 45 seconds, which felt, to the men watching her, like considerably longer. She was tracking the cycle, the interval, the reversal, the brief flat period before the next gust. She was looking for the pattern in the irregularity, the signal in what looked like noise. Her father had told her once, on a flat morning in their backyard in Flagstaff, that the shot didn't happen when you pulled the trigger. The shot happened when you understood the space. The trigger was just the last step in a decision that was complete long before your finger moved. She looked through the scope. The ridge came into focus. At this magnification, the heat shimmer softened everything, edges blurred, distances compressed. She could not see the target directly. She was not looking for the target. She was looking for the secondary outcropping, the 130 meters north of the assumed position, the shadow behind the shadow. She moved the crosshair slowly north. There. A shape that was slightly too regular to be rock. She breathed out. She made one adjustment to the elevation dial, not the standard correction, but the correction the notebook called for, the one that accounted for the vertical drift during the shear layer transit. Then she moved the windage dial 0.8 degrees right. Behind her, Kowalski watched her hands. He had been shooting since he was 12 years old, and he watched hands the way musicians watched other musicians' hands, looking for the thing that told you what someone actually knew. Her hands were loose. He did not say anything, but something shifted in his face. She located the cycle in her own breathing. In, out. The rifle became part of the terrain. She was no longer holding it. It was simply present, an extension of the same calculation she had been running for 6 weeks. For longer than that, since she was 11 years old in a backyard in Arizona, being told that a bullet goes where physics sends it. The gust came. She was waiting for the flat moment between gusts. 3 seconds. Tfo. 1. The sound of a rifle at range is not the sound it makes in films. It is not operatic. It is not satisfying in the way that film sounds are satisfying, which is to say it does not resolve cleanly. It is a flat, mechanical report that ends before you've processed it. And then there is nothing. And the nothing is where everything actually happens. Emily did not move after the shot. This was protocol: stay still, observe, do not introduce motion that compromises the next shot if a next shot is needed. She stayed in the prone, her eye at the scope, her breathing steady, and she watched the ridge. 1 second. The round was still in flight. At this range, with this velocity, it would take between 1.8 and 2.1 seconds to reach the target corridor. She had done the math enough times that the numbers sat in her chest rather than her head, which was the only way to carry numbers that large without freezing under their weight. 2 seconds. The men behind her said nothing. This was not out of respect or deference. It was because there was genuinely nothing to say. The decision had already been made and executed, and the world was now operating on consequences rather than choices. All they could do was receive. On the third count, something moved on the ridge. Through the scope, it was small, a shift in the regular geometry, a disruption in the shape that had been slightly too regular to be rock. It was not dramatic. It was the kind of movement that happened when something that had been holding itself very still suddenly stopped having to. Emily did not exhale immediately. She watched for another full second, confirming the pattern of disruption, reading what she could read at this distance. Then she lowered her cheek from the stock and set the rifle down, still pointed down range, with both hands visible. Inside the operations building, 43 seconds later, the first piece of coherent communication from Bravo Company in 3 hours came through the partially restored satellite relay in a burst of digital noise, and then, through it, a voice: Captain Alicia Donovan, Bravo Company's commanding officer, who had been in the valley since 0400 and whose voice was so completely flat and controlled that it took Renfrew a moment to understand that she was describing not a setback but a reversal. "Command element down," Donovan said. "We have movement. Fire teams are moving. Say again, hostile command element is down. We are executing. Renfrew turned to face the operations room and said something he would never remember saying clearly, something that carried the meaning without the precision. Bridges, in the doorway, heard it. He was already walking out toward the berm. Emily was still prone when he arrived. She had not moved. She was watching the canyon through the scope, finishing her observation, completing the sequence she had started. When she heard boots on the sand behind her, she removed her eye from the scope and began the process of safing the weapon. Bridges stood behind her and looked at the distant ridge and did not speak for a long time. Then he said, "Stand up, Corporal." She stood. The operations building was quiet in a way it had not been all morning. Not the quiet of people waiting for something to happen. The quiet of people who have received something they weren't fully prepared to receive and are taking a moment to integrate it. Renfrew was still at his console, headphones on, relaying Donovan's updates with a focused attention that was genuine but also served as permission not to have to look at anyone. The intel officer was updating the map with precise, unnecessarily careful movements. The logistics coordinator, who had not spoken in over an hour, was looking at a point slightly above the horizon line of the opposite wall. Kowalski was standing at the center of the room. He had the notebook. Emily had left it on the table when she went to the gun position, and he had been looking at it since she left, not continuously, not with the intensity of someone trying to learn something, but in the way you look at a thing that requires you to revise a conclusion you have been carrying for a while without examining it carefully. When Emily came in with Bridges behind her, Kowalski looked up. There was a moment, brief, consequential, where he might have said something inadequate, something that was technically an acknowledgement but really a defense of his previous position, something that conceded the outcome without conceding the assessment. He was aware of this possibility while it was happening, which was more self-awareness than most people have access to in real time. He held the notebook out. Emily took it. "The sheer layer," Kowalski said. "I've done 2 tours in desert terrain. I've never seen it work that way." "It works that way here," she said. "This specific bowl configuration. The ridge orientation on the west side creates a pressure differential that reverses the lower shear between 0900 and 1100 local time. I don't know if it's documented anywhere." "It's not," he said. "I checked the manual this morning." She looked at him. He looked at her. Neither of them said anything else about it, and neither of them needed to. Major Sharp, at the head of the table, was watching this exchange with an expression that was several emotions at once and resolved into none of them. He was not a small man in the conventional sense. He had a decorated record and a directness that people respected. But there are moments when a person finds themselves at the wrong side of a gap between what they believed, what turned out to be true, and the size of the gap determines how much it costs them to cross it. "Colonel," he said, looking at Bridges, "I want the record to reflect." "The record will reflect what it reflects," Bridges said, not harshly. "Let's hear from Captain Donovan first." By 11:40, all 512 members of Bravo Company had been accounted for. Captain Donovan's report, delivered over the restored satellite relay in segments over a period of 80 minutes, described what had happened from the valley floor with the kind of compressed, factual precision that was partly training and partly the specific voice people develop when they have been through something they have not yet processed emotionally and are functioning entirely on procedural clarity. The hostile element had numbered 22 individuals. They had established a command position on the secondary outcropping of the central ridge 31 meters north of the primary ridge axis, at an elevation that gave them line of sight to 2 of the 3 approach routes. The third approach, the north, would have been the natural choice for a relief force and would have been covered by a secondary fire position that Donovan's people found abandoned when they moved to clear the ridge. The command element's neutralization had been followed by approximately 4 minutes of disorganized fire from the remaining hostile individuals, during which Bravo Company had regrouped and executed a counter-movement that utilized terrain features the exercise planners had not originally mapped. 41 Marines had been wounded in total. 7 had been evacuated with serious injuries. None had died. This was the number that Bridges read twice when it appeared in Donovan's report. None. He sat with that number for a moment. In the operations room, someone began a sentence that would have been a compliment directed at Bridges himself, a reflexive piece of credit assignment that had more to do with hierarchy than with accuracy, and he stopped it with a look. "Write the report accurately," he said. "The call was made from this firebase. Write it accurately." Emily was not in the operations room when Donovan's full report came in. She had returned to the prep area after the brief, wordless exchange with Kowalski, and she was sitting at the same table she had occupied all morning, the notebook open, working through something. Not the shot was done, the outcome was known, there was nothing further to refine in that calculation. She was looking at the fence streamers again, watching the shift in the shear layer as the morning moved toward noon, because the shift was interesting to her, and because understanding it more completely seemed like a reasonable way to spend the remaining hour. Hutchins found her there. He stood in the doorway for a moment, watching her write in the notebook. He had known, for at least 3 weeks, that something about Emily Carter was more than it appeared on paper. He had not done anything particular with that knowledge. It was the kind of thing you carried and waited for the right moment to act on. And in the ordinary course of a training rotation, the right moment might never come. It had come today in a form he had not anticipated. "Bridges wants to see you," he said. "Okay," she said. She capped her pen, closed the notebook, and stood up. The conversation with Colonel Bridges was brief. Not because there was nothing to say, there was a great deal to say. And Bridges was aware that some of it was going to need to be said formally, with other people present, in the context of a review that would take longer than this afternoon. But the essential exchange happened in his office, with the door half open, over 2 cups of coffee that had been sitting on his desk since before the crisis started, and were now lukewarm, in the way that coffee in command offices is always lukewarm, as though the demands of the job prevent any liquid from being consumed at a reasonable temperature. "Where did you learn the shear layer analysis?" he asked. "I put it together myself," she said. "Base meteorology data, topographic files from the shared drive, 6 weeks of observation. You built a custom ballistics correction model in 6 weeks. It's not complete. It's specific to this terrain and these conditions." He looked at her over the coffee. "You understand that the Army has people whose entire job is to develop exactly this kind of model. People with advanced degrees and very expensive equipment and years of funding behind them." "I know. And you built something functional in 6 weeks with a notebook and observation. It's not complete," she said again. She said it the second time not as a deflection but as a precision she wanted the record, even the informal one, to reflect what she actually believed. "It works for this terrain. I don't know yet how much of it transfers." Emily did not say anything more. She had noticed, early in her career, that people sometimes phrased their respect as a kind of interrogation, as though they needed to verify something they already knew, and the right response was to let them verify it. "Why didn't you say something sooner?" he asked. "This morning you tried once and then sat down." She thought about this for a moment. "I said it once," she said. "The room wasn't ready to hear it. If I said it again at the same moment, it wouldn't change anything except make people more defensive. I waited for the moment when the options on the table had visibly failed." Bridges looked at her, then at the window. Then, for reasons he could not fully have explained, he smiled, not widely, not warmly in the conventional sense, but with the recognition of a man who has spent 38 years watching the gap between training and judgment and very rarely seeing someone bridge it cleanly. "Your father was William Carter," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. "I served with him. Not directly. But I knew his reputation." He paused. "He was exactly as good as they said." Emily held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at the middle distance between herself and the wall. "I know," she said. "The formal report, filed that evening, listed the resolution of the Bravo Company incident as the result of a coordinated response from Firebase Kestrel Command elements, utilizing environmental and topographic analysis. It did not name Emily Carter. It did not name anyone specifically. This was both a procedural choice and, in some ways, the most accurate thing about it, because the truth was that the shot was the last moment of a long sequence, and the sequence had started in a backyard in Flagstaff, and before that, in whatever moment William Carter had decided that what he would teach his daughter was not how to handle a rifle but how to understand a space. Bravo Company filed its own report. Captain Alicia Donovan, who had never met Emily Carter and did not know her name, added a single line to her personal notes that evening, which she did not send to anyone. "Someone from Kestrel made the shot. Whoever it was, they shouldn't have been able to make it. I'm glad they could." Donovan had been in the valley for 12 hours by the time the hostile command position went down. She had been managing wounded, managing fear, managing the particular grinding uncertainty of a situation where all the variables were outside your control, and the only thing you could do was keep your people as ready as possible for the moment the situation changed. She was 34 years old and had been in this work for 11 years, and she thought she had encountered most of what it could offer. Tuesday had added something to the list. She did not know the name of the person who had given it to her, and she suspected she never would, and she found, in a way that surprised her, that this did not bother her at all. The outcome was the thing. The outcome was the only thing that had ever been the thing. 3 days after the incident, Private First Class Marcus Webb, 19 years old, 8 months in, 2 weeks at Firebase Kestrel, found Emily Carter at the eastern gun position at 0530. She was watching the fence streamers in the pre-dawn light, which had a different quality from the mid-morning light and produced different behavior in the lower shear layer, a fact she had been trying to confirm for 2 weeks. Webb had been at the Firebase for 2 weeks and had heard several versions of what had happened on Tuesday, each one larger and less accurate than the last. He was not old enough or experienced enough to know with confidence which details were true, but he was old enough to understand that the person he was looking for was the one everyone was trying to talk about and that she herself was not talking about it. He found her at the gun position and stood a respectful distance back and said, "Were you scared?" Emily looked at him. He was young in the way that made her aware of how recently she had been young herself, or was still young, depending on who was measuring. He had asked the question directly, without the complicated overlay of competitiveness or defensiveness that older soldiers sometimes brought to it, and she thought it deserved a direct answer. "Yes," she said. He waited to see if there was more. "That's why I didn't miss," she said. He thought about this for a while. The desert was still cool at this hour, the air flat and clear before the heat began its daily campaign, and the fence streamers hung almost still in the pre-dawn quiet. "How does being scared help?" he asked. Emily looked at the streamers. At the way the lowest one moved first, the signal arriving at ground level before the upper ones registered it. There was information in that sequence, if you were patient enough to wait for it. "It doesn't help," she said. "Fear doesn't help anything, but it means the outcome matters to you. And when the outcome matters, you pay attention differently." She paused. Most mistakes come from not paying full attention, either because you're bored or because you're too confident. Fear is the thing that makes you check your work. Webb considered this. "Is that something your father taught you?" "No," she said. "I figured it out myself." Then, after a moment, "But he taught me to figure things out myself. So maybe he did." She went back to watching the streamers. After a while, Webb walked back toward the barracks, and Emily was alone at the gun position in the early light, watching physics operate on small pieces of red cloth in a way that told her things about the world that the manuals hadn't gotten to yet. She opened the notebook. She wrote something down. The formal investigation into the Viper Canyon incident concluded 47 days after the event. It produced a 22-page report that was classified, as most such reports are, with a summary that was not classified and that said, in careful institutional language, that the incident represented both a security failure and a coordination success, and that the lessons learned had been incorporated into future exercise planning. The report did not mention the name Emily Carter. What it did mention, in a footnote on page 14 that almost no one read, was a recommendation for further study of environmental wind shear modeling in bowl configuration desert terrain, specifically as it applies to long-range precision fire. The footnote cited an informal observational analysis produced by base personnel as the initial prompt for the recommendation. The footnote did not explain what this meant because the people who wrote the report understood what it meant and assumed the people who read the report would too, which was an assumption that turned out to be mostly incorrect. The notebook was not classified. Emily kept it. She added to it, in the months that followed, from other bases, other terrains, other configurations of wind and light and distance. The notation system she had developed at Kestrel proved adaptable. She modified it for mountainous terrain, for coastal conditions, for the specific behavior of air in urban canyons between buildings. By the end of her second year in service, the notebook was most of the way through its third replacement volume, and the model it contained had been tested, deliberately or accidentally, in 9 different terrain types and had been wrong 3 times, twice by her own assessment and once by events. She corrected it each time. The process of correction was something she had thought about a great deal. A model that was never tested could never be corrected, which meant it could never improve, which meant it was less a model than a theory comfortable to hold, impossible to trust. She had learned early that she could not afford the luxury of theories. She was in a profession where being wrong carried costs that did not appear on any spreadsheet, and the only honest response to that fact was to be wrong less often, which required being honest about when you were wrong more often. It was a cycle that looked paradoxical from the outside. From inside it, it felt like the only straightforward thing. No one asked to see the notebook. This was fine. She was not building it for anyone to see. There were days when she thought about her father in ways that were not quite grief and not quite gratitude, but something that combined both without resolving into either. He had not made her a sniper. Quantico had done that. He had made her someone who understood that expertise was not a destination you arrived at but a direction you kept moving in, and that the best practitioners of any craft were the ones who were most convinced of their own current inadequacy. The day you think you know everything about the space, he had told her once, is the day the space starts teaching someone else. She thought about that sentence often. She would think about it for the rest of her career. At Firebase Kestrel, some weeks after the incident, Kowalski pulled out the desert wind data he had been accumulating for his own records and sat down with a calculation that had been nagging at him since Tuesday. He worked through it once. Then again. The correction Emily had applied the 0.8 degree windage held through the shear layer transition was not in any manual he had ever read. He had been shooting for 22 years. He would not have thought of it. He sat with that knowledge for a considerable time because he was a thorough man and he believed that conclusions needed to be sat with before they were accepted, and because this particular conclusion required some rearrangement of things he had been carrying for a while. He was not diminished by it, he decided. That was the first important determination. The fact that a 23-year-old had seen something he hadn't seen did not mean 11 years and 2 combat tours had no value. It meant that a different set of formative experiences could produce a different set of insights, and that both could coexist, and that the appropriate response to being shown your own blind spot was to start looking more carefully in that direction. He got out a piece of paper and started writing things down. He was not as observant as Emily. He knew that now, with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who has been shown the gap between their own understanding and someone else's and has decided to treat it as a starting point rather than an insult. He was not starting from scratch. He had 22 years, but he was starting from something new, which was more than most people managed. 512 Marines came home from Viper Canyon. 31 had been wounded. None had died. The shot that made this possible was fired by a 23-year-old corporal on her first real deployment, from a position 40 miles away, in conditions that were considered beyond the reliable range of existing ballistics models. She did not receive a commendation. She did not ask for one. She went back to her notebook, and the desert kept teaching, for anyone patient enough to watch.